Major Tom found himself walking across the Yorkshire countryside. It was a fine spring day. The fields were green and the hedgerows were starting to bloom. He marveled at how a thousand-year-old hawthorn colony could still bloom. As he came to a fork in the road, he saw a small pasteboard box on the side of the road. It looked like the kind of box in which one would find a jigsaw puzzle. It had a plain white-hand lettered label that said, "Do-it-yourself universe kit." "That's curious," he said to himself. "I wonder what one would use to build a universe." He opened the box. As he put the cover of the box aside and looked into the box, he was sucked inside of it. After the first wave of terror left him, he tried to explore his surroundings. There weren't any. He seemed to be floating in a sea of nothingness. It wasn't quite blackness. It was just nothingness. The nothingness was so extreme that he couldn't even sense his body anymore. "I've done it this time," he thought to himself. "I've finally corkscrewed one." Another wave of fear washed over him as he thought about the possible meaning of this situation. He couldn't remember how he happened to be in Yorkshire. He hadn't been there since he joined the RAF. "I guess this is what it's like to be dead," he mused. "This must be the purgatory that they talked about. It would be bloody nice to have some substance to this nothingness." Suddenly he could sense a mass. It was a general feeling of gravity, an up and a down. It was hard to tell, because his senses still sensed nothingness. "I can't see a bloody thing. It sure would be nice to have some light." A subdued gray light surrounded him, but it was worse, because there was nothing to see, and except a feeling of up and down, there was no other sensation. He couldn't even sense the passing of time. "I can't take this floating anymore. It would be nice to have a place to stand." A vast desert totally devoid of anything but sand and rock appeared around him. The sameness of it all was mind-numbing. The desert silently went on forever in every direction. "This dryness is overwhelming. It would be nice to have some water." Suddenly everything turned to mud. This mud is not a good thing. It's worse than the desert. If only the sand and rock could be separated from the water. A sea formed. Waves washed the sand. He could not see or hear anything, but he somehow sensed a sea and a beach. "Is this a joke? I have a place to be, but no being to be there. It would be lovely to be there." He suddenly found himself in the sea. He felt small and wet in the sea, and still quite alone. He split himself into two entities. The two entities split into four, the four into eight, the 8 into 16, and so forth. The splits happened at an increasing speed. Sometimes the splits weren't quite even, and the two resulting beings were both quite different than the original. Some of the beings got scared and tried to recombine into one. That usually resulted in the creation of a third being, totally different, but still resembling the two beings that tried to recombine. Some of the beings clumped together. Some of the beings started eating other beings, while still others started to use internal chemical reactions to create material to make other beings. Soon the clumps of beings started to assign tasks to the various beings in the clump. As the clumps got larger, the beings making up the clumps became more specialized. Not only that, but the clumps became more specialized as well. The sea became crowded with competing clumps. Suddenly, the sea became too small for the vast number of competing clumps. Some of them moved to the surface, where they could get more light to run their chemical reactions. Others drifted into these to find shelter from the clumps that ate other clumps. Finally, some of the light-eating clumps washed ashore. Some broke down into their composite chemicals, and others adapted to the drier conditions. Soon the clump-consuming clumps moved ashore too. It happened first by accident, then some adapted and stayed for longer and longer periods. Soon the light-sensing tissues specialized to capture images and communications tissues specialized to interpret them. The light-sensing tissues noticed more and more about the surroundings, and the communications tissues adapted more and more to interpret the new images. These beings started to explore. As they explored, they adapted. Some of the adaptations were successful, some weren't. Tom's mind spun from all the conflicting images that were pouring in. Sound joined sight, and the cacophony was overwhelming. Tom started to cut the beings loose, one by one, granting them separateness. To keep them going, he kept a string tied to each to keep track, so he could revisit periodically to test the senses to see which one worked best to sense and make sense of this new universe. Some he cut loose totally and they died off. Others he kept the string to and they thrived. As conditions changed, as all things do, he cut loose other beings, or as beings could not adapt quickly enough, they self destructed. Finally, he settled on a warm blooded tree climber. It was omnivorous, sexually promiscuous, and very adaptable. He moved his consciousness mostly into the tree climbers and adapted them even more until the tree climbers started to adapt their environment to themselves. They made tools, first from sticks and stones, then from soft metals. Then they started fighting among themselves. The warfare improved their tools. Soon their tools used other beings as power. Later, the tools were self propelled. They envied the birds. They made machines that flew and flew them. Always warfare improved the machines. The tree climbers, which now only climbed trees as young or on special occasions, reached out to the stars. They left their home and started to explore space. He found himself hurtling toward the surface of a distant planet, out of control of his craft. There was a sharp pain, and he woke up in the ditch along the Yorkshire Road. He looked up just in time to see a large truck bearing down on him. He felt a huge pain through his entire body. Then everything went mercifully black. At Mission Control in Huntsville, telemetry indicated a rise in pulse and blood pressure for a few moments. Then everything settled back to normal. A technician put down his bag of chips and noted the time and date on a clipboard. Then he continued to eat his chips and listen to the ball game on the radio. The Braves were winning.